That's like an incredible improvement on something that actually matters to the food companies, to the insurance companies, and to the farmer. It's like, don't worry about how we do it. We can do it. You're not selling biology all of a sudden. You're selling something they understand and that they need.
Hey, Karl, how's it going?
I'm a little wet this morning, but I'm doing great. In New York City, it is flooding. We are seeing the remnants of Hurricane Ophelia, I think it is. So there's flash flood warnings in effect. Our basement is flooded. I was down there this morning to check it out. We've got a little bit of a driveway that has flooded because the drains have been overwhelmed. I hate to say it, but it is a common occurrence in New York City. And it's one of those things that I'm not sure how we fix given the climate crisis. You said your basement is flooded as well.
Yeah, it is. We have a WhatsApp group for our building. I think there's about 20 apartments, a small building. We live on the 4th floor, but I'm really concerned about the brownstones, especially those that have people living on like the street level housing. Some of it's below ground. When there was really bad rains in New York City, I forget what year, if it was last year or 10 years ago, time is an illusion. I can't remember, but there's a lot of people that got affected that died because they just were flooded in their homes because they live below ground.
Yeah, I have some friends after Hurricane Sandy. They live in Red Hook. Their street flooded. And not only did their basement fill, but the water was so high, it almost filled their first floor up to their second floor. I went there a couple of days to help them kind of clean up and dry things that could be salvaged, but It's pretty extreme. And over the course of the summer, we talked a lot about the heat, but the flooding is just as big a problem. We've entered the fall, and so flooding is a part of that. But it's one of those things that's just another, how do we take care of this? The infrastructure can't handle it. But let's jump into some biotech news. Yesterday, the National Security Commission had a meeting on emerging biotech, meaning biotech security. So this is something that we're interested in. We've got friends who are focused on biosecurity. We're doing a project for a biosecurity company. The big thing around biosecurity is that as biotech becomes more accessible, which is what we want, there is the potential for its abuse, especially since we're working with living organisms. It's not that hard to order DNA. It's not that hard to make things that maybe are nefarious. So it's good that these meetings are being held. Overwhelmingly, the promise of biotechnology is very positive. We know, and we are big believers of that here at the Grow Everything Pod. But it's good that these kinds of conversations are happening. So yesterday, I did see a picture of Jason Kelly, the CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks. He posted it on Twitter. I know he's one of the members of this security commission, and we're going to follow these stories a little bit closely because we don't want people to be afraid when at the government level, people are looking at the impact of biotech. It's all positive.
Well, I mean, I hope that's the case, but I don't know, with the way things are going and people's one-sided minds and stoking fear, it's concerning to me. Look at what happened with nuclear. It is actually a really great form of energy, but it stopped a lot of nuclear power plants to be built, it meaning the threat of nuclear war, and a lot of the fear stopped the perpetuation of using nuclear power. So I just hope that people are listening with possibility, but also have very clear regulation. I think that's going to be really important so people do feel safe. This is going to be such a complex topic to share with the public because not only do you have the complexity of policy and business, but you also have the complexity of biology. People hear virus, they're like, no, it's a bad thing. All those viruses can be used for good things as well. I would love to learn more about what emerged from that emerging biotech discussion. We should have Jason Kelly come on and chit chat with us.
Yeah, so I just want to comment, you're absolutely right. The fear of nuclear power has impeded its growth, but we are starting to see a resurgence because nuclear power tends to actually be cleaner than other powers, even when you factor in the fact that you have to eventually dispose of the radioactive waste. And there was a positive sign on this. I think earlier in the summer, the state of Georgia licensed the first potentially nuclear power plant in probably 4 or 5 decades. So there's some interesting things happening there. Erum, did you see the latest news from Meta, formerly known as Facebook?
What's going on?
So I just saw the beginning of this presentation this morning on Instagram, and then I looked it up on Twitter. But apparently Meta will be introducing a pair of Ray-Bans for $299. They're smart glasses that you will be able to use to record things. I'm sure they're incredible surveillance tools too, but a $299 price point is incredible. And I just am trying to imagine how creators are going to be using these things. I mean, just think about using them in the lab, but just using them in your everyday life. Weren't you an early user of some smart glasses? I seem to remember you had them at some point.
Yeah, the Snapchat spectacles.
Yes.
Are the Ray-Bans just recording device? Are there screen capabilities that you can see like augmented reality or anything?
I believe you can because they're AI augmented. I feel like Meta hasn't gotten a lot of recognition when it comes to their AI efforts. In my bookmark, I do have the Llama 2 AI program. I don't use it that often, but when I've used it, I've been very pleased with it. And that's Meta's version of ChatGPT. So I think an AI enhanced Ray-Bans would be very interesting. The other AI news that I found to be super interesting was this deal that Johnny Ive, the famed Apple designer, designed the iPhone. He just did a deal with ChatGPT. So I think you and I had like a very brief conversation about it. Like, what does the ChatGPT iPhone look like? I don't think that's necessarily what they're doing because we know that Apple is also developing AI. So I'm sure once AI starts to hit our phones, that's going to be transformational as well. But yeah, I thought it was a really interesting development.
Like I mentioned, I was an early adopter of the Snapchat spectacles. I think the challenge was, of course, people could tell, and you should let people know that you are recording. So they try to make it look sleek, but not too sleek that people wouldn't be able to tell that you're recording them. So people know that you're wearing the glasses. The challenging thing was the actual file type. When you uploaded the videos were circle. You know how we have like a portrait, landscape, but these were circles. So when you would post it on Facebook or wherever else, it would just be a circle shape, almost like a porthole into your world. I would love to see how the videos would appear on social media after you recorded through these glasses. And I do like the idea if they actually have a speaker so you could hear like an AI response. I'm starting to become very friendly with my Chat GPT because it's customized to my preferences and knows me more. I did opt in for the subscription. It is very, very useful. And I do like the fact that Meta is kind of going in this direction. If it does have a speaker, I want this to go beyond the phone. I'm kind of, again, tired of the smartphone. Where else can this appear? I mean, yes, we're in front of our laptops. Yes, we're in front of our phones. But like, is there something else? Could it just be in an earpiece? That would be kind of cool because the responses from ChatGPT are intelligent. They're clear. It is very chatty for me. It's like very conversational in text.
Right.
Once the audio version of ChatGPT comes out, I think that would be very interesting. I would sign up for that just to have a conversation. And we're all having conversations on our AirPods walking down the street anyway. So we already look crazy. And then I think for sure for the lab and being able to have hands-free interaction with data or recording, I think that's super important for contamination reasons. That is happening, I believe. I remember when Oculus for the consumer wasn't doing well, but it was doing well in a lot of commercial settings. And I believe like the lab, manufacturing plants, a lot of other places did really well. And I think this goes along with our brief conversation about gamifying biology. I think that's really exciting. And we do know that a former Oculus, founder before Meta bought it. So this was like the OG team is working on a biotech company. I think maybe we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
It'll be cool to see how this all changes the game when it comes to understanding and developing biology and biotechnology.
Yeah, I mean, these things, I'm looking at the website. They started at $299. The most expensive ones are $379. I kind of have a feeling these things are going to sell like crazy. For me, the thing I worry about with these things for me is I need glasses to be able to read with, so they wouldn't work in the office setting unless I could get them made prescription. But for walking around and recording, it does have audio built into it. I am very interested in this, and I think we're going to pay attention to it. Now, you had written full body scan. What did you mean by full body scan?
It's a big fad that's happening right now. A lot of celebrities have been promoting full body scans as a way of preventative medicine.
So is this MRIs?
Yes. A lot of doctors have been speaking up about this. There's a company that's been doing really well. They've been getting celebrities and influencers to come in and get full body scan recorded, talk about it to their audiences and really hype it up. And the concern is people will use it as a preventative measure and see like a tumor or see a growth, which happens regularly in our bodies. It's like the the ecosystem and the way that our bodies are, that we might have cancer, but that's not going to proliferate so bad that you're going to die. There might be a cancer, but then it might resolve itself or just live in a dormant state. But they might find something and then you'll go and get it checked even more and spend more money, get a biopsy, it might cause more issues. So that's like the counter for that. But I think obviously a lot of times when there's something new, there's two sides of a spectrum, but what's in the middle? Let's get full body scan, but let's do it intelligently. I think it's something we should pay attention to because yes, it's an MRI, but mixing that with a blood panel and other specific biometrics, what can we learn with our bodies? Can we actually do preventative measures? Mixing it with our genetic information, I think there's a lot to be explored, and this is just the beginning of it.
Yeah, it makes me think of two things. One is people have built these multi-$100 million businesses on regular blood panels, more comprehensive blood panels that you would normally get. People are doing this for longevity. Athletes do it to kind of track, even amateur athletes are doing it. I pay very close attention to the blood panel when I get my blood work done twice a year. And I might even do it quarterly if I was really trying to like hack my body more actively. I do remember that when 23andMe first started out, there were certain genetic traits that they would make you fill out a disclaimer before they showed you. I happen to be one of those people who have some weird genetics that they wanted me to click and okay before I looked at them. I'm not dying tomorrow, but there is Alzheimer's in my family. And I think the big concern is that most consumers aren't educated or ready to receive this kind of news. So I think it creates an opportunity, and this could be another multi-billion-dollar company, is helping people really understand the results that they're receiving before they even go to the doctor. I think it's a good thing. Why don't we skip down to the cultivated meat lobby so that we can get this party started? What was your idea for that?
Yeah, so we've been speaking with so many cultivated meat companies, investors that want to invest in the space, coming to us, asking us questions and really trying to wrap their heads around it, because we at Messaging Lab, Karl, you specifically, did a deep dive into the cultivated meat industry from speaking with everyone we know in the space and coming from the world of biopharma and what they're doing. And the big question of price is always the top question. There's been a lot of talk about the parallels between what happened in the livestock slaughter meat world, where government poured a lot of money into it. When will they start pouring some money into the cultivated meat world? Is there a coalition? And I'm sure there is, something that we need to look into. I had gone to the SOSV Climate Tech Summit, which was a virtual summit, and this came up a lot, the fact that government is subsidizing heavily the livestock slaughtered meat world. What will it take for government to start subsidizing and creating infrastructure, pouring R&D dollars into the cultivated meat world so these companies can get a head start, so investors aren't just putting all this money in infrastructure, which is not necessarily going to result in a high return for them. That's going to be a huge cost that they might not want to take on, which then is causing not as much investment going into this industry. So I think we should find out who's doing it, Karl, because we're living at the center of this now because of all the people we're talking to and people that will be coming on the podcast. We just interviewed recently. We'll be posting that podcast soon. What do you know? What can you tell us really quick about it?
Okay, so based on our research and the people we've been talking to, the cultured meat, alternate protein space is very underinvested in. And we're putting out a report where we compare research and development dollars in other industries. And it's clear that agriculture, it does an abysmal job at funding research and development. I read this report by Rethinking. One of the points they make is you can't make cows more efficient. They're as efficient as they can be in terms of like how quickly they grow. I mean, this is the same case with chickens, but we don't have the infrastructure. Like one of the rate limiting steps for the clean meat, cultivated meat, alternate protein space is there's not enough infrastructure to really help produce things fast enough to make an impact. So, and the amount of money that goes into it is very small. The farm lobby, the meat lobby, the agricultural lobbies are very strong. They have a lot of money. And for many years, they pushed against alternate proteins. They didn't want things to be called meat. That has changed. And it's always worth noting, it's interesting, the incumbents, at the same time that they're pushing against a new technology, they're also investing in it. So like the Cargills, the the Tyson, the Purdue's, they were all pushing against naming these new products meat. But at the same time, they're pouring investment dollars in because they don't want to miss the opportunity, even if the opportunity doesn't really become something until the long term. It's just something to be aware of. And I think talking about cellular agriculture is really an opportunity for us to segue into our podcast today. We have had Aanika Biosciences on the podcast. Very early on, we'd had Ellen Jorgensen, the Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder on. And so now we're going to talk to the CEO, Vishaal, who is one of our Brooklyn Mafia peeps. They're building a big lab in Industry City. Vishaal has been very actively promoting the lab and also the fact that they have a lot of space and benches available to rent to other scientists. And the prices are very compelling, by the way. Before we bring Vishaal on, what do you want to say about Vishaal, Erum?
Oh my God, Vishaal's so cool. He's a great entrepreneur. The audience will learn the fact that he's not from the biotech industry. He's from the world of finance and just heard about DNA being written as a code and being able to have a DNA barcode. He saw Ellen's TED Talk and he went for it. And look how far he has come. So let's hear his story. It's going to be exciting to hear how someone that's not from biotech came into the world and shook it up. So let's let Vishaal take it away. So, hey, Vishaal, how's it going?
It's going well. How about you?
All good. Thanks so much for coming onto the Grow Everything podcast.
We're thrilled to have you.
And thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, you're part of our Brooklyn Biotech Mafia. So we do have the pleasure of seeing you frequently.
That's right.
We always talk about sometimes work, what's going on in Brooklyn, but I really don't know a lot about your past. So one of the things that I really wanted to know is what really sparked your interest in leveraging biotechnology or biology? What was that? Because I know you have like a finance background.
Up until getting into synthetic biology, I spent most of my career in finance. So most recently, I was a portfolio manager at a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund where I traded insurance-linked derivatives, credit derivatives, interest rate swaps. And that's really what I spent 10 years doing. A lot of the stuff you've seen in movies, probably like, I don't know, Moneyball or The Big Short. That was really my focus, which was like, how do you manage risk with financial derivatives? And how do you look for unexploited opportunities, express new ideas in the markets?
So it wasn't Wolf of Wall Street?
It was the complete opposite of that. It was like a very nerdy, like nobody speaks very loudly, quiet, intellectual kind of thing where you're just trying to find new opportunities and it gets a bad rap, but it really is like following this chain of thought and this logic to express an idea. But I guess what led me to biology and this whole world was this random investment that I made, this random like hobby of a snack food that I helped launch. And it had a key ingredient coming from India, but it kept having issues with supply chain. So tens of thousands of pounds of it had to have been thrown out at the border because of different pests and different banned chemicals that were used to fumigate it. It was just all this like murkiness in the supply chain. And the product itself was being sold at Facebook's headquarters and like Google headquarters around New York. It was doing pretty well. And then it kept running into these supply chain issues. And this pet project became a real nightmare and like a real problem to deal with. So I ended up driving up to the border of the US and Canada in Vermont and literally working with the FDA to throw out tens of thousands of pounds of this stuff. And I was like, this is ridiculous. This is a problem. How do you not know where this thing came from? Do we have no information on this? And then a couple of months later, my son was born and I was up late. I came across a TED Talk. It was Ellen's TED Talk about GenSpace and was just blown away. I was like, I wonder if there's a way to use this biology to solve a problem like this. And then ended up going to GenSpace for like gene hacking 101 or whatever it's called. I just was blown away. From there, just sort of brainstorming ideas with different people at GenSpace. And here we are 6 years later or something. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, supply chains are currently in the news a fair amount. There's a lot of talk about localization or nearshoring, but you described the issue of having to destroy tens of thousands of pounds of product. Why are supply chains so broken? And Aanika solves that problem.
I think the biggest problem we see is that in the first mile of the supply chain is incredibly transparent and there is a lot of technology that happens after it's already in processing. So you have no issues once things are in that proper processing and distribution channel. The problem is in the beginning. So when it's coming out of the ground, when it's coming, again, that first mile, that tends to be the most complicated part of the supply chain with the least amount of technology. Before you can put on a barcode or a label, how do you mark those things? How do you have any provenance or how do you have any sort of control there? And so that's what we do. So we've created a spray basically that's comprised of Bacillus subtilis spores that we've engineered to not germinate. You spray them on and you basically have a unique DNA sequence in each finished batch that we can then trace back to the origin in any situation. You don't need a lot of them. And about a liter of it can tag 30, 40,000 pounds of food. It's inert, so it's not growing, it's not replicating, and it's totally safe. So it's a really good solution to this problem.
So in terms of helping our listeners understand, because we at Grow Everything really are trying to bring biotech into the mainstream, and not a lot of people are familiar with microbial tags and how DNA can be used to track things. Can you illuminate this a little bit for our audience? Exactly, like, you say you spray it on the produce, but then if it's found, if this produce then gets shipped to a grocery store and it has some type of contamination, how do you decode it?
Yep. So it's really similar to the way you would look for any other, I hate to make this analogy, but everyone knows about COVID testing now. You've got a rapid test, you've got a PCR test. It's very similar to that. What we're essentially doing is just attaching a unique DNA signature. So it's almost like, if you think about it, like a chemical signature, just enclosed in the bacteria is just a way to protect that DNA from UV light, sunlight, heat, things like that. But what you're essentially doing is just adding a level of DNA to something that you can trace back later and look for it later with a similar thing to a COVID test. I mean, that would be the most crude way to explain it. But it's a pretty simple process to swab that food product, that ag product, and then run a similar test like that just looks for DNA. And there's been a renaissance in diagnostics pretty much because of COVID and things like that. So it's becoming easier and easier to run that process.
And to be clear, the bacillus, it's a spore.
Correct.
So this is what these bacteria use to reproduce, but they don't reproduce. And these things are safe for human consumption.
Correct. We just got final FDA ruling on it just a couple of days ago. Totally safe. Again, they're not growing. For your listeners, a spore is basically if you starve bacillus, you starve certain bacteria, they create a hardy shell around their DNA like a seed, and they just become dormant. In nature, they can be revived a million years later, actually. It's incredible. But we've actually engineered them to not be able to do that. So once they go into that sort of seed form, if you want to think of it that way, that's it. It's done. And you just have this nanoparticle that's stuck to things that we can recover, crack open that seed, and then just run a pretty simple test to look for that unique DNA signature.
Wow, I mean, that's incredible. And I will say that we are no strangers to using COVID as an analogy or a gateway into biotechnology explanations, because it has blown the technology open. People can relate to understanding a bit more because it's been in the media a lot. So definitely appreciate we're no strangers to the COVID analogy. So thanks for that. You have the product. I know you guys are expanding right now. So you're talking to people in the industry. How are they responding to your approach? Because it's completely different. You're talking to farmers?
I would say not individual farmers necessarily, but big co-ops who represent thousands of farmers. And it's been interesting. So we launched a company at the end of 2018. And it took a while to actually build the technology, get the right approvals and things like that. But what we noticed, and I think this is a function of my background, was we knew from the beginning that technology doesn't sell itself. And I think it's a big problem with synthetic biology companies in general. You have a lot of cool stuff, but that doesn't necessarily translate into viable businesses. From the outset, I knew we had to do something else. Like the technology is not going to drive food companies to adopt new technology, especially when it sounds so crazy and it sounds so out there. So to answer your first question, we knew it would be a challenge. I mean, we were proven right. It's just difficult to get people to change anything, even if it was a piece of software. Like nobody is quick to adopt anything, let alone like, hey, let's spray inert Bacillus subtilis spores all over your foods. We'll see what happens. We knew that was just not going to work from the beginning. So we spent a couple of years developing an insurance wrapper around that. We really asked ourselves, like, look, this is great. Traceability is great. And I should also mention that we also couple our traceability with antimicrobial peptides that we create. So in layman's terms, ways we can prevent E. coli growth, salmonella growth, listeria, without the use of harsh chemicals, which is how it's done now.
Oh, wow.
A lot of food and fresh produce, chicken, things like that are literally dunked in like chlorine. That's how they sanitize them. Bacteria use their natural immune system. So we're just overexpressing those types of peptides to accomplish the same goal. So we bundle those two things together. So you've got traceability and then an element of prevention, if you want to think of it that way. So when it came to like going to customers and talking to the market, we realized we needed like a spearhead. We needed something more commercially viable. We built this insurance wrapper around the technology. And what that means is if you think of traceability, a lot of things come to mind, like, is this organic or is this sustainable? But all of that is a top layer, which sounds really good, but a lot of companies don't really want to pay for things like that. But we looked at that and said, what this really means is that if you're involved in an insurance claim, you can determine whether you even were involved or not. And we can get to the source of that insurance claim much faster. So if you take something like a food recall contamination insurance claim, it can take upwards of a year right now to settle that with the insurance company. We can do that in like a PCR test. That's like an incredible improvement on something that actually matters to the food companies, to the insurance companies, and to the farmer. It's like, don't worry about how we do it. We can do it. You're not selling biology all of a sudden. You're selling something they understand and that they need. On the preventative part, we're lowering the odds that that thing happens anyway. So if it's a food recall contamination, again, just to stick with that, we're actually doing something about the E. coli outbreak that could cause the claim. And then we couple that with monthly pathogen testing and things like that. But the idea is we built this cool technology, but instead of putting it in the hands and trying to convince people on why it matters, we use it to deliver something that we know that they need, which is this whole insurance wrapper. And so you're getting an insurance coverage, or basically the way we interact with those customers is, will you buy this insurance policy, which looks like the other insurance policies that you've been buying, but it settles much faster. We've been trying to appeal to that aspect of their problem. And then how we do that is the use of our technology, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I'm going to, I guess, create a fictional example just to confirm. I'm growing thousands of acres of a certain kind of lettuce. I spray my product with your tag. It gets mixed with a lot of other kinds of lettuce as this happens, and then it goes to market. Let's say there's a recall, you're able much more quickly to identify who was responsible for that outbreak, number one. And then number two, if I was not responsible for it, I can potentially file a claim to get my money back that I would have lost because my product has been taken off the market.
That's almost exactly how to think about it. There are examples like that across all commodities and a lot of different risks where, because of that first point that we talked about, that complexity in the supply chain, because there is no transparency there, people don't know who's involved, who's not involved. You have no idea. And that process of sorting that out takes forever. And as a result, creates higher premiums. It means less adoption of insurance. There's something called FSMA regulation. It's a food traceability regulation that's in play where companies have to be compliant by 2026. It mandates traceability, for example. So it's another tailwind for us. But companies are really struggling with it because it's such a problem, especially in that first part of the supply chain. So because of all these reasons together, cumulatively, it creates a higher cost and just like more burden and then more friction in the entire supply chain. So just with these bacillus spores, essentially, we can solve many of these problems at the same time. And it's not that sexy. We're not going to like the end consumer. It's not this very obvious problem, but the back end infrastructure of our entire economy is like, what's insurable? Big companies, it's like, what are the taxes on it? And like, what is and isn't insurable? By going this other way, I think we're about to go to market like at scale. So we'll see. But it's just a different approach than I think a lot of other biotechnology companies, which is we built some really cool technology and now we're looking for the problem to solve, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point. Got to build a technology after you see what the problem is.
First,
build
right,
technology
exactly.
for the problem, but that's not the case a lot these days, especially when it comes to the software world. Carl's painting a picture of a fictional example, but recalls have happened a lot in US and across the world. On LinkedIn recently, you highlighted the documentary Poisoned on Netflix. Yeah. Did you watch it?
Yeah, I did. It's exactly what we're saying. We think it all gets exacerbated with warmer temperatures too. So.
Oh, yeah. So there's a lot of examples of recalls, or not even just recalls, just poisoning without not even any regulations or consequence. The main products you'd be spraying would be produce. You're not going to be spraying eggs or anything, or?
For right now, actually, yeah, dairy, eggs, we're getting into everything now, but we're starting with produce, but we're expanding kind of fast.
The lettuce from Yuma, that recall that happened with the E. coli, you would have, of course, sprayed at the beginning, sprayed the actual product. And so a lot of that E. coli poisoning happened on the consumer side because they, at that point, were either eating burgers from restaurants or buying the products from the supermarket. So why did it take so long for them to discover that it was the lettuce? Where would Aanika have a role there?
The way it works is usually someone goes in and reports that they're sick.
Yeah.
And sort of local authorities start gathering data, do the investigation. Where did you eat last week? Oh, well, I ate 13 salads last week or whatever. Not me, but like somebody probably does that. But that's exactly the problem. Where do you start with this?
Yes, yeah.
It's a very brute force kind of optimization thing. So for us, that part wouldn't change. For the customers that we use, we're already sampling every month. So in that scenario, somebody goes in, I'm sick. Maybe they say, okay, we think it could be one of these restaurants. they start sampling and they send all of that out for pathogen testing. And that's how they start trying to connect the dots. The paper records are very spotty. So it's sort of this like mosaic approach of trying to put together all these things. And they'll say, look, well, this probably came from Salinas or Arizona or wherever. And then they start working backwards. So with us, when they go send it out for the pathogen testing, we've worked up ways to alert them to basically run an Aanika assay. See if there's a barcode on there while you're doing this. It's not any additional process really. So look for the Aanika barcode. And if that's the case, then we can get to the source. We can narrow that down much faster right off the bat, as opposed to the way it's done right now. So it's really about us alerting the different labs. And there's a network of tried and true labs that handle all of these things. So it's really about plugging into those, which we're doing. We're talking to the local authorities and just making them aware that there is a method that they can run, an assay that they can run to get to the answer much faster.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, we've been doing a deep dive on the cultivated meat, alternate protein space. In doing that, I ended up reading this book, Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. And he says something like 1/3 of the stomach illnesses that Americans experience are due to food that has some form of contamination. We're talking specifically about produce, but it could also be, initially you mentioned chickens being dunked in bleach, chlorine solutions. That stuff hasn't changed out that much. So there's a lot of room for improving the supply chain, making it more transparent. And I've always admired what you guys are doing. I think it's fantastic.
I appreciate it. One of the biggest learnings that I've had is, so it's funny because we're dealing with all these different people. The business model is complex, to say the least. When we deal with the insurance companies, there's also an underwriting element to it. We've accidentally improved on multiple facets of the food insurance world. And one of them is underwriting. I'm a farmer, I'm a food company, I want food recall insurance. The way it works now is it's a very subjective way to get that insurance. They sit down, they look at something called your food safety plan. What are you going to do if this happens? Well, I'll do this. Okay, that sounds good. It's this really very manual approach. And we took this data approach. We hired these great guys to build this underwriting model for us that looks at about 30 different factors. So a farmer can give us just what are they growing, how much of it they're growing, and where exactly are they growing it. That's pretty much all we need. And just from that, we use all these different data sources to come up with an underwriting pricing for them. And then we layer it on how much savings we can apply because of our biotechnology as well. So we take this whole approach. But what's really interesting is what we found is one of the biggest links to recalls is how close are you growing produce to poultry processing facilities, which is funny because it's not even the cattle. That's one of them, but it was lower on the list. But poultry, proximity to poultry is just such a big one. And then about of those 30 different factors, 10 were basically how much moisture is in the air, just rain, how much frost accumulated, how much it snowed, all these different things. And it makes a lot of sense. You've got wet, stagnant soil, and then you've got probably some downstream runoff from one of these poultry places. It's a huge factor in the risk profile of one of these food producers. It's so funny that this kind of food safety just never gets much attention, probably because, again, it's not a very sexy industry, but it's a massive problem. And we just find it funny that we're accidentally uncovering some of this stuff. But we're supposed to do one thing. We're just oh, why? How come no one's looked at this before?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting that you say that being near a poultry producer is a risk factor. And do you guys also factor in how close you are to either beef or pork?
Yeah, we do. We look at that too, but it's not as, I would have guessed beef for sure. Just when you drive through California, it's all of that middle section of California. It's all CAFOs or whatever. But the poultry it seemed like the data was pretty clear. The proximity to poultry was a really big factor. And I don't know enough about the poultry industry to know why, but maybe because they don't go outside or something. I have no idea. It's probably something.
Yeah. I was going to say with regards to poultry, it's the rules are super funky. And of course, the poultry producers don't want us to really know what they are. But you can have it say free range. And all that means is they have an open door. It doesn't mean they can go out.
The free range distinction just means there's a door in the thing.
Yeah, and it's open. Yeah, it's something like that. And I mean, if someone's listening and I'm wrong, please let me know. But that's the way I understand it. The other thing is that the cages in which these chickens are grown, they're smaller than a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and they're stacked on top of each other. But the reason I asked about pork, and I'm sure that this happens also with steer, though, I was just doing some research on the biggest steer cattle feeders. They do turn the manure into a product. I'm under the impression, and I'm sure that some of the manure from pigs also gets turned into a product, but they also process a lot of that manure by just spraying it. They disperse it. So proximity to one of those facilities, I wonder how that increases or decreases risk.
Both of those were definitely on the major factors list. They were just lower than top three, I believe, from our analysis.
But it makes sense. I watched Poison and they had the footage of the livestock farm, the cow farm right next to the lettuce, and cows just going poo and in the water, and that water being irrigated onto the lettuce. And I'm like, how could they do that?
How can they do that? It doesn't make any sense.
But actually it does, because it's fertilizer. Right. But obviously at that scale, with all the cows and stuff, and not isolating the cow that has E. coli or that has like the disease, that's the issue. But that's probably the mentality they took. They're like, all right, well, fertilizer, why don't just put it, spray it on, First, I was just like mortified to see that, but I'm like, wait, no, they probably did that strategically because it is fertilizer in the end.
Yeah, I think people don't really understand what the scale is and then what it does to the environment. The numbers are just astounding. I don't know them off the top of my head, but the amount of manure that a cow produces is like 10x what a human produces.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, I'm with the people who are all for regenerative agriculture, and they're like, if we did the cattle drives across the plains and they would poop along the way and they would stomp the poop down and that would fertilize the soil. But that doesn't address the amount of meat that we produce, or we wouldn't be able to produce as much as we produce. And then it doesn't address the agriculture side that you're talking about on the produce side, because you're not going to have like cows going across your lettuce fields. You're going to plow under and then grow lettuce.
I'm like not very popular with some of our VCs. Like when I start talking about the reality of some of this stuff, I'm like, that'll never work, because like the scale, it's like no one has seen, I'm sure they have, but it's like the scale of these things is massive. It's really industrial. It's not just a term. This isn't just cows walking across. It's the first time I saw the cattle farms, like in California, I was shocked. I was like, I cannot believe it's like a city, right? I mean, city.
Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know. I don't know how you solve some of these bigger problems, to be honest. I love the idea of cell-based agriculture and all of that. But like, then you look at that and then you look at the problem. I'm just like, I don't know how these things connect. They seem like just totally two different worlds, but I don't know. I guess we'll get there, but I think they just need to be improved. That would probably be the easiest thing to do if that's possible. Really hard to like retrench some of these industries.
Yeah, I mean, then like the numbers are just, I don't know, they're just humbling and outrageous, whatever term you want to use, because the US grows 9 billion chickens a year. That's like 1 point something chicken per person on the planet. You can't do that unless you're doing it in a factory.
It's fascinating to me. I guess this down market that we're in is interesting only in the sense that like, I think things that'll make it through this, I think this could be a good filtering process in some ways for some of this technology, because things that are really going to work will probably come through and things that won't. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's a good thing. So we can allocate more capital to things that actually have a shot at working to solve these problems. Whereas if it's just spread out among a whole bunch of, I'm really talking about cell-based meat and things like that. I don't know how I feel about it. I know plant meats had an issue. I mean, in the sense of like, I think it's really cool, but can you get to the scale that like it matters?
Yeah, that's the biggest issue.
That's the biggest issue. Doesn't any of this stuff scale to that?
We're working on it.
Since we've been doing a deep dive on it, there's a lot of invention, a lot of innovation that needs to happen in this space. If you were to scale cell ag, the way that pharma works, the biggest mammalian cell culture facility is in South Korea. It's run by Samsung Biologics. It's huge. It's like 250,000 liters of production, but you need to 10x that, and you need 500 of those facilities in the United States.
Is that true? That's how it works out? That's crazy.
Yeah, that's like the back of the envelope. I was writing about it this morning, so I've got the numbers at my fingertips. But when I hear people talk about it's never going to work, it's often you're not taking into consideration the energy inputs that you need, but energy is getting to zero marginal cost. So that's not going to be an issue, I think. But you still have to feed all those cells, and you just can't do it the way pharma produces. You don't need pharma purity, you need food purity, which is less. Still pure. You don't want it to be contaminated, but there's a lot of work to do. So I agree with you. I think it's going to be interesting to see which technologies make it through.
Do you think, and I know we're like off topic, but do you think there's, and I don't talk to enough companies because all I think about is all this food contamination. Like, are there huge leaps and bounds in replacing FBS, for example? Is that the goal? I mean, you can't use FBS.
So for our listeners, is fetal bovine serum, which is used to grow a lot of cells, not just cultivated meat cells. And so that is typically removed from young cows. And yes, there is a lot of innovation happening in that space. There's a number of companies that are producing alternate media, so you don't need those baby cows. And there's a number of companies that are looking for ways to produce the growth factors that you need in cultivated meat in alternative ways. So we know two companies just off the top of my head. I know there's more. Cocoon Biosciences, who was on this podcast, they use cocoons to grow those growth factors.
Oh, that's cool.
And then there's a company who we worked with at Messaging Lab called Core Biogenesis that produces them in a very fast growing plant. So the growth factors actually end up in the seeds of those plants, making their extraction and purification much easier. But there's a couple of other ones. So there's people addressing that. It's just the question on all of this stuff is it moving fast enough to make the impact so that when we do start to build these huge facilities, which could be the downfall of the industry, because that was the downfall of biofuels, was the need to build these humongous facilities. Right. Can you get the price down cheap enough, fast enough, so that you can make this impact on the planet and feeding people? So this is an off topic, but I want to bring us back to Aanika, because we're talking about scaling, and you guys are expanding your lab in Brooklyn from, you're 10xing it. You're going from 2,500 square feet to 25,000. How do you plan to utilize that space, and what challenges do you see with scaling up?
Yeah, we're taking this approach where we built this really unique business model where essentially, if we see a risk that biology and synthetic biology specifically can address and mitigate, then we've got this built-in revenue pathway. We don't want to have to raise $100 million and invest in all sorts of new peptides or trying to do stuff in citrus screening disease or whatever. We would rather license that stuff or work with other companies who are already focusing and like the experts on that and help them generate revenue through this insurance model. So with that space, we're really hoping to populate a lot of other companies in there with complementary technologies that we can help scale, get through regulatory, and then push through this insurance platform. And we think that's really going to be key for us because there are people working on all these different problems. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel. And we know that it can be challenging for a company to generate revenue in the traditional sense with pilots and things like that. We understand all the barriers that sort of through our insurance platform, Aanika can in a way be their customer. We're doing this with a company right now. It's like we're buying something from them, using it on our application, and then basically just incorporating it into our insurance offering. And so we've got this really cool system for doing that. And that's really the idea behind the space. And then coupling that with biomanufacturing. So small batch biomanufacturing is a real hassle. It's been a real hassle for us. We've had to ship things to the south, to all sorts of universities, super costly. We're standing up a CGMP, food grade manufacturing in that same space. And all of this will be done like in the next couple of weeks, actually, believe it or not. Not only can companies sort of be there and work on their technology and we can help them get the regulatory, we can actually help them produce their products. It's also obviously for us, but during the downtime, we can help them produce product and get to market a lot faster through this insurance platform. The other part of this is Aanika set up our own insurance brokerage now. Aanika Insurance Services is in the midst of getting licensed and becoming what's called a cover holder at Lloyd's of London. We've got this end-to-end infrastructure. We're backed by our big insurance company. And it's like, we've got this whole end-to-end way that we can take technology, look at a risk, connect the dots, literally draft insurance policies and get to market really fast. The idea here is that we can prove this out with our technology and then look at all these really interesting technologies that are promising and sort of on the verge of getting to market and really accelerate them and give them a space, make their thing, and just grow.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a problem where you see that your model could help them grow? Like what problem, what solution do you see that would fit perfectly with this insurance model and biotech model?
Yeah, so one I'm really excited about, it's called citrus screening disease. Oranges having a serious issue with this problem. And insurance companies are basically walking away because it's just, they don't understand it. Specialty crop insurance doesn't cover the greening of these oranges. And it's a big problem. It's creating a lot of downward pressure on prices and orange yield. And so insurance companies are like, hey, whatever, like we're just not going to touch it. But it's a bacterial infection. And so there are companies working on ways to use peptides to solve that issue. RNAi, for example. There are all sorts of like biotech companies working on it. Insurance companies don't know enough. So the idea here is like, we know what looks promising. We've just done all this regulatory work with USDA and FDA. We know that there are ways to get pilots out there with temporary regulatory approval and things like that. Partnering with those companies and then providing those orange farmers with this new type of crop insurance would be one example. You mentioned regenerative agriculture earlier. So that's another one that's super interesting to us because switching from traditional to regenerative agriculture typically comes with like 2 or 3 years of losses because there's a reduction in the pesticides and all the chemicals that they use. So people are hesitant. But over time, regenerative ag farmers tend to have less crop insurance claims. So we're looking at that as like, look, if we can use biotechnology to accomplish the same things, the chemical inputs they were using, if we can replace that, mitigate those 2 years of losses, because long-term, they're better risks to underwrite, essentially. That could be an interesting play for us, maybe a little bit further out there. But these are the types of things that we're looking at where we can essentially use insurance to incentivize better practices. The insurance companies don't have enough technical knowledge in this field to really make any assessments. So we can step in, provide risk cover, and we understand the technology well enough, the underlying technologies well enough to figure out what's going to work and what's going to have an impact on underwriting.
It's so wild. I mean, as we've gotten to know each other, Vishaal, and as Aanika has evolved, I just am like, number one, who would have thought a synbio company would become an insurance company? And number two, the number of applications that you've mentioned, it just seems like there's many to come. So in my mind, you guys are super on the right track and easily a $100 billion company.
I appreciate it. I hope and I appreciate that. I mean, for us, like we're going out to market this fall, this growing season, and we should be writing policies at scale this spring. And so that's going to be like a huge inflection point for us. And that's sort of the synthesis behind this space too, which is like, if this works for us, we've already been tagging like 3,000 to 5,000 pounds of greens in Long Island. And that was like our first insurance policy that we issued. But if this works at scale, it's a copy and paste model across many different risks, many different applications. We've got other biotech companies reaching out to us with, hey, we've developed a coating for some fruit or vegetable lasts longer, or we've got some, whatever their technology is, like we've got a better diagnostic for airborne viruses or whatever it is. Can we work with you guys to create insurance cover around it? So we've hired our second insurance underwriter just recently in London. That's sort of the idea. We're like coupling biologists who understand the technology with sort of innovative underwriters who can create these risks. And spending that 2 years educating the insurance industry is really paid off for us because we really have developed this business model with a moat around it where we're like the bio people in these circles. It's just interesting to see this evolve.
We should introduce you to a couple of friends of ours who are in the cannabis industry because this could be huge for them.
We've talked to a couple of cannabis. The challenge in cannabis is really that we've seen, because it's cannabis, a lot of insurance companies won't touch it.
No,
Exactly.
regulations in each state.
Yeah, it's like they're very conservative. And we're dealing with reinsurance companies too, like in London.
Yeah.
And it's changing, but that's been one of the biggest. There's definitely a need. It's just that a lot of the insurance companies are very hesitant to, because it's such a highly regulated industry, to touch it. So that's been kind of an interesting thing that I never had to think of before.
So we've got a friend, he's got the third most listened to podcast. He's a big investor in the space. He's always very critical of the New York rollout of legalization because you've got basically 3 dispensaries in New York City that are legal, and you've got all this product that's being produced, and you don't have a big enough market to sell that product to New Yorkers. And so as a result, you have all of these illegal bodegas that have popped up that are all selling California product or product that is contaminated. It's a huge issue. And I could see, maybe not right now, but maybe in like 5 or 10 years, the industry is going to mandate testing and those kinds of regulations, which are probably in place in California and Colorado. But
Yeah.
So you guys fit right into that.
No, for sure. It's funny because I think in the next few years, there's just going to be a much more talked about problem, like contamination, things like that. I think climate change or whatever, I don't want to get into what people's opinions on it, which is weird, but temperatures are changing. I think we can all agree on that. And warmer temperatures, warmer water, more stagnant water, more rain, all of that is a hotbed for pathogen growth.
Yeah.
See this as a much bigger problem in the coming years than I think it gets attention for. I think it garners attention.
Agreed.
Right. Well, I mean, I know you see that in the next few years, but you're new to the biotech industry. I think that's really admirable. That's what we try to do here at Throw Everything is really look at beyond the PhDs of the world, who is leveraging biotechnology in interesting ways. And it's great that you come from a finance background and you're able to look at this technology in a different way and apply it in such an innovative way. Karl and I talk about the different business models that biotech companies can employ, but this one is very unique. I think it makes a lot of sense. So it's congratulations to you. But since we're nearing the end, one of the things we have to ask all of our guests are, you're in the biotech industry, you've been to SynBioBeta. What other biotech companies or bioproduct companies do you admire, do you think are things that are going to last?
Well, I'm really impressed by Pivot Bio, to be honest. The way they've scaled and the effectiveness of their product. I think I saw recently they're like hitting 100 million a year in revenue.
Yeah, that's right.
I think the problem with the whole industry is that like you get a lot of really sexy sounding stuff. I've seen this cycle where you've got VCs that don't fully understand. They are like, okay, it's computing in the 80s. So they make these comparisons, but there are a lot of nuances to this where it's got so many of its own idiosyncratic challenges. Try to apply that and then they get disappointed and then capital dries up. There's like over expectation and then disappointment. And then it's like, oh, this sucks, which is really bad. And that happens on like these cycles in this industry. So It's really great. We need more companies like that just are tried and true and scale and have something that people want. And that will help the industry with less of the super hyped up, total disappointment kind of stuff. So I'm like a huge fan of them.
What do they do again? What does Pivot Bio do?
It's just fertilizer. It's almost like a potash replacement. And I think it's nitrogen fixing bacteria, but I don't think it's engineered.
No, it's not. I might be wrong. I did do some work for them early on. It was a long time ago, but very smart. And it is an approach that, for example, Ginkgo and Bayer were taking. Different approach. They were taking a more engineered biology approach. And just so that our listeners know, hundreds of thousands of tons of nitrogen are put onto crops to make them grow better. Much of that is never used by the crop and ends up in our water supply. So that kind of fertilizer, though it has enabled a green revolution, it has also wreaked immeasurable damage on the planet.
Yeah. And it was like a smart business model. It's like, we're not going to engineer them, but we'll get to market a lot faster. I really respect the business model. I see synthetic biology companies really focused on that. And I think they're going to have to be more and more of them just because the endless R&D is just not going to fly anymore. So I guess to answer your question, I'm always like, what was the other one? I heard about them through you guys, the hair products company.
K18 hair.
Oh, like so cool. That's another one. It's like really cool. And they had it's an ingredient in a better product. It's a smart play for synthetic biology and it works. And it's like scaling. So all of those kinds of companies, I'm just like a huge fan of.
That's a finance guy in you. Speaking of...
yeah, sorry.
Cool.
Well, we want to be mindful of time, Vishaal. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you think we should have?
No, I think it's been fun talking to you all. Thanks so much again for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. We can't wait to have you on again.
Great.
Erum, what did you think of that interview with Vishaal?
Vishaal, he's my brother from another mother. Let's just say that. I love the guy. He's great. Coming from the world of finance, just blowing it out in the world of biotechnology, really cracking some eggs. I mean, food safety is so important. The way that he's leveraging the DNA barcode and spores and formulating it's very safe coding to be able to have these spore tags on the food. And then just the new business model that he thought of. I'm sure he worked with other advisors as well, but to create this insurance layer on top, I think it's genius. I think we need to see new business models. It's something that you and I have been talking about is where are the new business models? Because biotech is not software. We can't just do a SaaS model and licensing fee for everything. So what else can we do to present value and present a path forward that is not just, okay, you're just going to pay me monthly. Although I'm sure, yeah, obviously the pay insurance, that's probably still the name of the game, but in a new and different way. The fact that Vishaal came from left field, the finance world, and yes, he was dabbling in the creation of food and he saw food waste and saw a problem and just attacked it. And I was like, all right, we're going to do this. Oh, I found this DNA barcode TED Talk by Ellen. I'm going to find her. I'm going to go there. It's just a classic story. It's just a great story, great example of entrepreneurship in the United States.
I completely agree with you. I love Vishaal. I wish we could hang out with him more often. We don't get to hang out with him enough because we're all busy. I'm fascinated by business model development in general, which is probably why I love startups so much. Startups are basically companies in search of a new business model. They're not mini or baby versions of big companies. And knowing Vishaal and knowing Ellen, the company had originally started as a food safety bar coding company, and it has pivoted to become this force in insurance. And I think they're going to be very big. To me, it's like insurance companies. I might be wrong. Vishaal, if you listen to this, correct me if I'm wrong. It seems like the insurance companies always have to be designing new products given that risk changes. And with climate change, risk is going to change even more. So having a product like Aanika's that can make it easy to trace food back to its source, whether it's contaminated or not, when it is contaminated and when there's some kind of outbreak, I think is key. As we were recording this, E. coli was in the news. There was a E. coli outbreak in the Midwest that caused, I think, something like 30,000 tons of meat to be recalled. Damn. This is very common, and being able to trace back where that's coming from is very important. Vishaal and Aanika, they have a winner, and my hat's off to them.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. And I really appreciate how he thought about his lab space in Industry City, which I love that area. If anyone has been there or is coming to visit Brooklyn, I highly recommend going to Industry City. You can see the Statue of Liberty at a distance, but lots of shops. It's a very cool space. And there's a couple of other biotech companies that are in Industry City. The Brooklyn Army Terminal is not too far from there. And
Brooklyn Army Terminal is where BioBat is.
Right. And that's not too far. It's a little bit more inconvenient in terms of being able to take subways. You could just take the D or R train to Industry City. Okay. That's just the New Yorker in me just talking about how to get to places. But I love the fact that he's time sharing his lab.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think it's great. I know that in New York and Brooklyn, there is no shortage of lab space, but it's not very clear and organized. Something that we were talking with our friends in our Brooklyn Biotech Mafia is that there are a lot of opportunities for people to start biotech companies, but at what stage, right? If you're just doing some very, very preliminary research that's simple, you might be able to go to GenSpace, especially if you're not in biotech and you need to start learning about some biotech processes. GenSpace is the place to go. But then there's biolabs, there's IndieBio. Those come with their own programs, whether it's investment or cohorts you have to apply. But if you just have some cash and you want to get started, Vishaal offers a very interesting alternative that you're working with another company. You're sharing resources with another company that's in it with you, not necessarily that's a part of a program or something else that you might not need if you are like a serial entrepreneur, but you just need to do a fermentation run or two to develop a product, maybe for people that are in the personal care and beauty. They are trying to make something. They don't need that much volume to create a big enough batch to generate revenue. So I think that could be interesting. I'm so curious to see who Vishaal knows because he has made a name for himself in the biotech industry, to see who would come on board and use that space. I mean, you and I always talk about doing a run of some type of product. It's coming to us as we talk about it. Maybe we'll just hit up Vishaal and be like, hey, look, can we borrow this on a Saturday night and create this thing? So I love that. We talk about infrastructure being a huge issue when it comes to creating biotech products, cultivated meat being the big one. But maybe, we can start testing it out at Aanika.
I think it's a great idea. And it offers another option for people in New York. You mentioned GenSpace and Biolabs and IndieBio. There's also the Alexandria Center. There's Harlem Biospace. So there's a number of resources. There's things being built out in Queens and in New Jersey. We do not lack for lab space. And that's something that's very different than other cities where, for example, Boston lab space is very hard to find because of the number of biotech companies that are there. And we know people who've moved to New York because of that. So I think it's a very interesting idea, and I'm glad that Aanika's doing that. I don't think I'll be spending any Saturday nights in the lab at this point, but you never know.
You never know.
We do have some ideas that we're working on. As we close this episode out, Erum, is there anything else we should cover?
We should cover the fact that you're flying away for a week and we're going to miss you. Where are you headed off to again?
Well, I will be in France for the next week, but the podcast will roll on without me. And probably by the time you listen to this, I will have already returned. And it's all good. We run a business. We go away on business. We take time off, but the podcast continues.
Yeah, I'm sure you're going to meet a bunch of people. I'm excited to hear how that trip goes because we know a lot of it is spending time with your wife. It is your anniversary and exploring and hiking the French Alps. Then you're going to spend some time in Paris and maybe do a little bit of a wheeling and dealing. So hopefully you come back with some great news.
Hopefully. Yeah. I mean, I don't know about great news, but at least some interesting news. Let's put it that way. All right. Well, that's the pod. As we've been saying on the Grow Everything podcast, we have a hotline. If you have a burning question or recommendations of guests to interview, please do look up the number in the show notes. Save it under your contacts. You can text us. We've been getting texts from people. We love that. Thank you for listening.
See you later.